All right, so today we'll be extending the conformity part of the class. We'll be talking more about conformity. And today and next Tuesday and then again next Thursday, we're going to be kind of covering selected topics in conformity. So today we'll be talking about groupthink and breaching, which are themselves not particularly related to each other. They're just kind of special topics in conformity. And then on Tuesday, we'll talk about unpopular norms and pluralistic ignorance. The reading for pluralistic ignorance is a really good one. I suggest that you read it very closely because I love it, and I'm very likely to ask many questions about it on the exam. And then on, what are we going to do then? Okay, well anyway, and then bystander non-intervention will be next Thursday. We might go a little fast and end up covering these a little bit faster than that, because next Thursday we also want to do a review for the first exam, so that you all are ready. I know. It's terrible. There's going to be an exam here. I know. You thought it was going to be fun. It's going to be the most fun exam you've ever taken. Okay, so today, first we're going to talk about groupthink. And groupthink is a conformity-related concept. Let's talk on the front row there, please. Thank you. Groupthink is a conformity-related concept that was invented by Irving Janis. Or it was maybe said, I think, in an interview by some other social psychologist, but Irving Janis is the leading theorist of groupthink. He wrote a book in 1972 called Victims of Groupthink, where he talked about the following dynamic. And here's Janis's definition of groupthink. He defines it as a way of deliberating that group members use when their desire for unanimity overrides their motivation to assess all available plans of action. Now, that's maybe a little bit confusing, so I've made a different definition for the purposes of the class, which I think is a little clearer, which is the tendency of groups to make poor decisions when desires for unanimity outweigh careful, informed decision-making. Okay, so when would this happen? Well, okay, so this is supposedly common in committee situations, especially when you have a big autocratic or authoritarian boss who everybody obeys too much. And this little cartoon, and this is a very funny cartoon. You're all laughing. I understand why. It's a very funny cartoon. This cartoon is supposed to sort of give you a sense of how groupthink works, okay? Here the boss says, oh, here we go. The boss says, all those in favor say aye, and everybody says aye. But what are they thinking? They're thinking, oh God, say it isn't so. You got to be kidding. Perish the thought, heaven forbid. In their heads, they're thinking, this is a really bad idea. We shouldn't do this as a group. But for some reason, they all go along with the group decision. So groupthink is a situation where groups fail to mobilize the best information that they have, information like, can you all stop talking there too? Information that these people have in their heads, they're not saying it, and they'd be able to make a better decision if they did. So let's talk about this in more detail. A great example, perhaps the most discussed example of groupthink, is the Challenger disaster. Most of you probably aren't old enough to remember the Challenger disaster, but I was 9 years old, or 8 years old, when the Challenger disaster happened. And, well, what was unique about the Challenger shuttle mission, this NASA mission? Yes? There was a teacher on board. What was her name? That's it. You don't have to know. That was pretty good right there. Nice. Krista McAuliffe. Very good. Okay. There was a teacher on board, and it was this kind of funky thing that NASA was going to do to try and make you feel more connected to the space program. They were going to put a regular civilian, a normal citizen like ourselves, on this space shuttle, and then we would feel like more connected to NASA or something. I don't totally understand the purpose of this, but we were, I was like in a public school. I was in an elementary school, and I was told, wow, like a real teacher, like your teacher, is going up in the shuttle. This is going to be awesome. And indeed, me and all of my fourth grade friends, we were gathered around. We were supposed to watch the Challenger take off and head into space. And what happened? Well, what happened was it exploded, and it was a horrible, horrible disaster, and really all of America was watching. In a lot of ways, because of this whole take a civilian into space thing, it was one of the most watched shuttle. You, please don't talk. You can eat, but don't talk. You can, all of you, eat, but don't talk. It was one of the most watched shuttle missions in, since 1969 when we went to the moon. It was a big, big thing. Everybody was watching, and it all went terribly wrong. So what'd they do? Well, they did what the federal government always does in situations like this. They put together a commission to investigate what the hell went wrong. because all of America was sort of like, wow, we had gotten used to all these space missions working, and then all of a sudden this one went terribly wrong. So what they did was they put together this blue ribbon panel with a whole bunch of very famous people, this retired Air Force general, Chuck Yeager, the guy who broke the sound barrier. Or no, he didn't. He was like the second guy to break the sound barrier anyway. Oh, no, he was the first guy. Okay. So Chuck Yeager was on it. And then this guy that we talked about earlier in the class, Richard Feynman, was on it, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who came up earlier. Do you remember when? Does anybody remember when? Okay, it was in the philosophy of science part of the first lecture. He's the guy that defines science as the bending over backwards to prove yourself wrong. And that quote gives you some kind of insight into what sort of guy Richard Feynman was. He was just this relentless skeptic. He was a physicist, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist at Caltech, and his distinctive feature was this sort of playful mind that he had, and he was very skeptical, and he was always causing trouble. He wrote a couple popular books that were really big in the 80s, including Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, and What the Hell Do You Care What Other People Think. Anyway, big hero of mine. This guy was awesome. You should read these books. They're a lot of fun. So Feynman wasn't going to take the role on the commission. He was like, look, I'm not a bureaucrat. I don't like to do this. I'd like rather work on some physics and get some work done. And his wife told him, you know what's going to happen is they're going to put together this commission. They're going to get a bunch of yes men on this commission. It's going to look like that, right? And they're going to make a bad decision. They're not going to really evaluate what happened. She was basically saying that as they investigate this NASA groupthink phenomenon, the committee itself, the commission itself, is going to itself exhibit groupthink. And Feynman's like, okay, maybe you're right. And she was like, if you go, you're going to mix stuff up, and maybe we'll find out the truth. So that's what happened, was Feynman took the role, and he joined the commission. And pretty quickly, it became clear why the Challenger shuttle had blown up. What had happened was the O-rings on the booster rockets, those big rockets that they use to get out of the Earth's atmosphere, which then fall off and go into the ocean somewhere, they'd been poorly sealed for some reason. And this, a little bit of fluid, or the booster rocket fuel, came out, lit fire, and destabilized the booster rockets, and then the whole thing caught fire. What Feynman wanted to know was why. And he did a bunch of research. And as it turned out, what was happening was a bunch of people in NASA who knew exactly why would feed him information and kind of lead him along the trail, because they wanted somebody to figure this out and fix it, but they were afraid to stand up and be whistleblowers. So Feynman was gathering this evidence. He's being fed this evidence by scientists and engineers who were uncomfortable with the situation. And what he found out was that the O-rings, the rubber O-rings, these rings that connect or seal the different parts of these booster rockets, because they don't make them in whole. There's no factory big enough to make an entire booster rocket just in one piece. They're in a bunch of different pieces. They have O-rings, rubber O-rings in between, which are meant to seal it so that stuff doesn't get out like that. But what the problem was that at very low temperatures, these O-rings didn't work well. The rubber got really stiff and rigid, and they couldn't survive things like if wind hit the booster rockets, hit the shuttle, it would shake the booster rocket, and all of a sudden the seal would break. If they were, like a fluidy sort of rubber, if they were less rigid, no problem. But in cold temperatures, they would get very rigid and they wouldn't seal properly. So engineers had said, look, you can't do shuttle launches at low temperatures. Things will go terribly wrong, and the thing might explode. The O-rings won't work. So they had this on file that you can't launch at these sort of temperatures. But NASA, the higher-ups that had to make the decision to go with the launch or not, were under a lot of pressure. There was a launch window. There was a certain frame of time they had to launch in. They had all the media set up to cover the Krista McAuliffe stuff. Supposedly George Bush Sr., who was vice president at the time, was going to be there. And there was all these pressures to launch on time. And so what they did was they made the decision to launch on a very cold morning in Florida, and it was a horrible, horrible mistake. And then they tried to not cover it up, but not make it easy to figure out. So Feynman went poking around, and he figured out this was the problem. The O-rings, it was too cold for the O-rings to work right, which meant that the integrity of the booster rockets was violated, and that's where the explosion happened. It's not exactly an explosion, but whatever. And he went back to the commission and he said, this is what happened. This is what happened, is they had the information, but they didn't mobilize it to make the right decision at the group level. It was a groupthink phenomenon. And the commission, again, is made up of yes men, or at least the head of the commission was sort of one of these yes men, right? And was like, well, okay, we'll put that in the final report, but let's hold that off for this next press conference. Let's just say we're working on it. We don't know what the answer is. And Feynman's like, no, we know what the answer is. It's over. Case closed. I know what happened, And the guy's like, well, we don't want to ruffle any feathers here. And Feynman's like, what are you talking about? So they go to this press conference, and the head of the commission goes and says, well, we're not exactly sure what's happening. And Feynman is sitting there, and they're distributing a sample of the O-ring rubber. And Feynman takes it, and he's told a couple journalists he's going to do this. He takes it, drops it in his ice water. They're all sitting up there, this blue ribbon panel, drops it in the ice water, gets it really cold, takes out a hammer that he brought with him, and then breaks it, and it just shatters into pieces. And like the assembled international media goes bananas. They start like taking pictures, and they're like, screw the head of the commission. We don't care about you anymore. Like, Feynman, what's going on? You got to tell us, you know. And so that's how he decided to just break through the dynamic and just be like, look, I know the truth. This is the truth, and this is what happened. So Feynman is badass. That's the point of the story. But the point is that they had the information. The engineers and the scientists that had designed the booster rockets knew exactly what would happen at cold temperatures, and they knew it was a failure, you know, that they shouldn't launch on that day, and that it might be a disaster, that it was a high-risk launch. The people who had to make the decisions just didn't, they had that information, but they didn't mobilize it. They were under a lot of pressure, and it was a classic, perhaps the classic, groupthink outcome. So what is groupthink? I've given you the definition, but how can you know what it looks like? How could you know if you're in a situation that it was a groupthink type situation, that the group you're in might make a bad decision or even a terrible decision like NASA did when they went ahead with the decision to launch the Challenger? Any questions about this Challenger example? Okay, cool. All right, so what are some symptoms that you're in a group with groupthink? One, an illusion of invulnerability. Classic example with NASA, right? They hadn't had any significant problems since the Apollo 13 mission, and before that, they didn't have any fatalities associated with any sort of space mission since I think 1966, the Apollo 1 mission that had Gus Grissom, and the liquid oxygen caught fire before it even had launched, and Virgil I. Gus Grissom and two others died on the launch pad before they even took off. But they had tons and tons of successful missions. In general, everything had worked fine. And in fact, NASA was in some ways considered maybe the most respected part of the US federal government because they took us to the moon, you know? They did spacewalks. They did crazy, crazy shit. No one ever thought would ever be able to, I mean, I still can't believe any of that happened. So in illusion of invulnerability, when a group thinks that it's invulnerable, it'll be less likely to really carefully, skeptically evaluate the decisions that it's making. Also, unwavering belief in the morality and or competence of the group. When you think that you're right, either right in a moral sense or right in a factual sense, you don't, again, tend to be sufficiently skeptical about the decision-making that your group is doing. By the way, these are straight out of Janus 1972. So if they seem a little redundant, blame Janus, not me. Collective rationalizing of group decisions. Groups that tend to do this, that tend to not look at the faults of the group, not look for where they might be wrong, but instead try to rationalize everything that the group does, are headed for failure. And indeed, maybe they should listen to Ice Cube. Shared stereotypes about the outgroup. This comes up when groups are in competition, like when countries go to war and armies are going up against each other, or examples like that. Where groups are in competition, firms, maybe in a market, when you have shared stereotypes about the outgroup, that can also propel groupthink. When you think, oh, everybody on that side is incompetent and dumb, and we all know that, then you can underestimate your opponent and fall into traps. And we'll talk about a couple examples of that. When group members withhold criticism. This is essentially, I don't know why Janice said this 3 times, but this and that are all relatively similar. But this is a specific thing where groupthink is especially likely where group members are afraid to criticize the group or its members. So if you're in a group and you're afraid to speak out and say, wait, I think that the shuttle, you know, I'm pretty sure that these O-rings are not going to maintain their viability in this launch. If you're afraid to say anything, then nobody might say anything. If nobody says anything, then a terrible disaster might happen, a bad group decision. Yes, sir. Question? Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think I understand your question. So isn't this? Well, I think it's an artifact. To answer your question, I mean, I think it's an artifact of individual and group dynamics. I think it's, on the one hand, people are afraid to speak out because of basic conformity pressures, like the Ash study. But sometimes what can happen is when everybody's afraid to speak out, that weirdly you won't mobilize information that in fact everybody knows. And this diagram, I mean, in some ways this diagram is like the big thing to pay attention to today, because I think it really covers groupthink really well. This is a classic scenario where groupthink might happen, is somebody suggests an idea, they're just throwing it out there, or maybe they're just one person that just has a bad idea. It's a bad idea, and they say, who thinks this is a good idea? And everybody's sort of like either too nice or too afraid to criticize, or maybe intimidated by this person in authority, and so they don't speak out. But when it really goes wrong is when one of these people is right, or when everybody's right and they just are afraid to speak out. And then you have a situation where, weirdly, the majority of the individuals in the group know better, but the group makes a bad decision. So yeah, it is about an emergent group mind that maybe doesn't work as well as individuals would alone, which I take to be part of your question. Okay, so here are some symptoms of groupthink. Here's some more symptoms of groupthink. Wonderful. Okay, perceptions of false consensus, where you think everybody agrees with the decision, so you don't speak up. You think, essentially, that you're in the Ash setting, right? Where everybody's saying that line matches that line, and you're like, wow, that doesn't seem to be the case. But you shut up because you think everybody agrees at this point, and you want to fall in line. But what happens if everybody's kind of in that situation? If everybody, what if there aren't any Confederates, essentially, in the Ash study, or there's only one or two, and everybody's just falling in line? Then you get this perception of false consensus. And we'll talk more about perceptions of false consensus when we talk about pluralistic ignorance and unpopular norms. Also, when there's pressure on dissenters, pressure is not to dissent, either because a group has really high solidarity or for some reason really values unanimity or conformity. That pressure on dissenters will, undermine whistleblowing and dissent and lead to bad group-level decision-making, or it can, at least. And then also, self-appointed group protectors who insulate the group from criticism or dissent. And I don't know about you, but I'm thinking of people that I've known. I've been in groups where some people will always sort of jump up and be like, why are you criticizing the boss? The boss is always right. You need to shut up with your criticism. Those people can be very destructive for group functioning, right? Because what they do is they stifle dissent, they stifle skepticism, rather than mobilizing it so that we can make better decisions. So here are some other possible examples that have been brought up in the groupthink literature. I'm not necessarily saying that all of these are examples of groupthink, but these are ones that people talk about. The failure to anticipate Pearl Harbor. A lot of people say, we had the information. We actually had, I think, an intercept of a Japanese radio broadcast that suggested there might be an attack on Pearl Harbor on that day. What day was that? December 7th? 2nd? 7th? 7th. Yeah, December 7th, 1941. All right. Okay, we're good. Okay, December 7th, 1941, they had a radio intercept from the night before or the day before or something like that that suggested there might be this attack, and that the information just somehow didn't get mobilized into doing anything about it. The Bay of, and of course there's these theories that FDR actually wanted us to get into World War II, so he sort of put the kibosh on responding to this information. Radical, crazy conspiracy theories I don't necessarily endorse. The Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. How many of you all know about the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba? Okay, cool. Okay, so I'll cover it really quickly just for the benefit of those who don't. So the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba happened in 1961, in April of 1961, I think. It was John F. Kennedy had just taken over as president. He was only 3 months in, and the CIA asked him, hey, Eisenhower already okayed this plan for us to take a bunch of former Cuban guerrillas who we've trained, people who left Cuba after the communist revolution, who are pro-capitalist, pro-America. Eisenhower okayed this CIA plan to take them and train them to be guerrillas so that we can then land them in the Bay of Pigs for an invasion of Cuba that would hopefully spark and foment this anti-communist revolution, because these expatriates from Cuba believe strongly that, in fact, Cuba did not support this communist government that it had. And so Kennedy's like, all right, if it's okay by Eisenhower, I'll go along with it, I guess, but I don't want any open conflict with the Soviet Union. We need to keep this Cold War cold and fight it passively through satellite nations. And so that was one of the weird things about the Cold War, was the U.S. and the Soviet Union were locked in a war for 30-some years, 40-some years, but they never were openly firing at one another. They would fight it through satellite countries. So the Soviet Union would fund a communist revolution in Vietnam, and then we would go to Vietnam and fight on behalf the Vietnamese. And this led to all sorts of entanglements where the U.S. and Soviet Union are fighting in these countries. So Cuba was one of them, or was going to be one of them with the Bay of Pigs invasion. And so Kennedy's like, the thing I like about this plan is the part where we're not sending U.S. soldiers. Then it can't be pinned on us. We're not directly fighting the Soviet Union or a communist country. So I'll go along with it. So they go along with it, and in April of 1961, they land former Cuban citizens who were trained as guerrillas in the Bay of Pigs, and they're waiting for air support. They think that the U.S. Air Force is going to come and knock out tanks that are there to respond to the invasion. But Kennedy decides not to. He doesn't want a hot war. He doesn't want to spark international instability in the middle of the Cold War 3 months into his term as president. And so as a result of that and just the fact that the whole invasion was incredibly poorly planned, the guerrillas did very poorly. They way overestimated the amount of anti-communist sentiment in Cuba. Nobody really rose up to overthrow the government at all. And it was just this huge, huge groupthink example. And in fact, Che Guevara sent a letter later to, I think, Kennedy via Dick Goodwin, one of his consultants, or one of his advisors, who's played by Rob Morrow in the film Quiz Show, and send him this memo saying, hey, thanks a lot. You just totally galvanized solidarity behind the communist government in Cuba with this silly invasion that totally failed. This has been awesome for us. So the Bay of Pigs invasion failed at a number of levels. On the one hand, Kennedy probably should never have okayed it since he was never really on board with it. He never really thought it was a good idea, and he wasn't willing to go all in. So they never really got the support that could have made it effective. But even if they had gotten the support, there's every reason to think they couldn't have sparked an anti-communist revolution in Cuba in 1961. The sentiment just wasn't there. They completely overestimated how much people didn't like communism. Why? Because they asked a bunch of people who didn't like communism who'd left Cuba for America. Very dumb. And then furthermore, there weren't enough guerrillas anyway to actually take control of Cuba, not even close. And so as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion is often celebrated as, it's often identified as one of the great examples of groupthink. I'd say Bay of Pigs and the Challenger disaster are the big ones you hear the most about. Any questions? Okay, another example that's often cited is the persistence of the Vietnam War. The U.S. got further and further involved in the Vietnam War. We even elected a president in 1968 who said he would he would reduce troops in Vietnam, who actually increased them. And the Vietnam War persisted for roughly 10 years, more than 10 years really, with a lot of people feeling like we were losing more than we were gaining and that it wasn't a very effective engagement, but feeling we were stuck in it. And a lot of people have theorized, how did we ever get there? And it is a complicated story of decision-making by Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, and a lot of people identify as a classic example of groupthink, where they should have known this was a bad idea. They should have known that the Vietnamese would fight, or the North Vietnamese would fight forever, that it wouldn't be easy to get an anti-communist revolution going in Vietnam. But they didn't. They underestimated what they were up against, perhaps because they had shared stereotypes of the outgroup, and as a result, tens of thousands of Americans died. Have you ever seen that movie, The Fog of War? It's a documentary about Robert McNamara. It's a great documentary if you want to know the decision-making that led to the Vietnam War. Speaking of great documentaries, have you seen Enron, the Smartest Guys in the Room? That's a good documentary. That's got Milgram references, some good stuff in there. Very social, psychological take on the Enron scandal. A lot of people identify the Enron scandal as a good example of groupthink. Now, why is it a good example of groupthink? Isn't it an example of corporate corruption, where you have a bunch of very greedy guys who head up this corporation and rip off people, citizens of California, and rip off a bunch of people in America, and then in the end don't quite get away with it? Isn't it an example of greed and corporate culture gone awry? Well, yeah, it may be that, but let's remember that all those guys went to prison. They didn't get away with it. It wasn't in the end good for them. And indeed, they thought that they were invulnerable. They thought they were the smartest guys in the room. They thought they could, rip everybody off and get away with it. But in the end, they underestimated their collective opponents. And that's a great film you might check out. And then, of course, there have been a variety of articles that have been written in op-eds and stuff suggesting that the invasion of Iraq might have been an example of groupthink. At the risk of being political, I'll put the question mark on that. But, you can figure it out for yourself what you think. Okay, so where does groupthink come from? I've told you a little bit about the symptoms that Janice identifies for when you can notice that you're in groupthink, but where would it come from? Or rather, I guess Janice is identifying symptoms that would help you know that you're in a groupthink situation and or in a group that could maybe become a groupthink situation. So what are the antecedent conditions that lead to groupthink according to Janice? Well, one is group members are highly cohesive. They share a strong sense of cohesion that leads to strong conformity pressures. And those conformity pressures stifle dissent and undermine skepticism, leading to bad group decision making. Other characteristics of the group setting that can lead to groupthink: insulation from external forces, no checks and balances. There's nobody there that's job it is to be skeptical of the group's decision making. A variety of leadership dynamics can lend themselves to groupthink, especially highly authoritarian leaders, perhaps with too much power, who everybody defers to and feels they have to defer to. When you have very powerful leaders, essentially, no matter how big the group is, the leader is always making the decision. Homogeneous group membership. Here I think about the Ash experiment. And a lot of people have said, oh, the homogeneity of these groups, where it was all upper middle class white males in the 1950s at elite colleges, that's why you get this conformity pressure, because they're all the same. They're trying to be like one another. And again, you think of balance theory, right, where you're more likely to assimilate to somebody's opinion if you like them. You're more likely to like people that are similar to you, etc. Homogeneous group membership can create higher levels of groupthink because it increases conformity pressures, but also because when you have a homogeneous group, people know the same things. They have the same perspective. They have the same point of view. And they may be less likely to say, wait a second, this is a bad decision. I know something the rest of the group doesn't, and I'm going to say it. Poor handling of information. When you have incomplete information or you use it selectively, then you're more likely to make bad group-level decision-making. Stress, time pressure, that can lead groups to fail. The Challenger disaster is a case in point where there's all this stress and all this pressure to get the launch off on time, and that led them to not mobilize all the information they should have. I think stress, time pressure, that's one of the big ones for sure. I think that was also the case with the Bay of Pigs, where they'd set this invasion day, and they maybe had some reason to be worried about it. They didn't finish really talking to Kennedy about air support and getting a commitment from him. He didn't totally know what he was getting into, I think. And that pressure, I think, was a large part of why the groupthink result happened. So how can you prevent groupthink? I've told you all this vaguely redundant stuff that Janice said about where it comes from, the conditions that lead to it, and how you can know you're in a groupthink situation. But how can you prevent groupthink? Well, one thing is you can establish standards for control. You can have oversight committees. You can have individuals who challenge group decisions. Related to that, you can appoint a sort of designated devil's advocate whose job it is to be skeptical of decision-making. And this is actually a very healthy way, I think, to be on a committee. If you have a committee that you're in that has a lot of power and you're making a decision and it's high stakes and you think everybody's kind of just going along with it, maybe appoint yourself devil's advocate. Yes, I've said earlier in the semester that can make you very annoying to people, but what you can do is you can say, look, I'm just playing devil's advocate. I'm not even necessarily endorsing this, but what about this? Maybe we haven't considered this enough. What about this? Maybe we need to think about that. And if you do that, then the group might make better, more carefully reasoned decisions where they've evaluated all the options and all the counter-arguments and come to this conclusion before making the decision. And again, it might be useful to deflect the responsibility for that dissent, that skepticism, and say, I don't necessarily endorse this. I'm just saying we should probably think about this before we make the decision. And ombudsmen at universities are sort of like this, right? If you've ever been to the ombudsman, you know that their job is to hear your criticisms of the university or the institution or the classes you're in or something like that. If you didn't know that that's what the ombudsman does, then the ombudsman is going to now get 25 calls in the next couple hours. But that's okay, they should. That's what their job is, to be a university devil's advocate. Okay, or an organization devil's advocate. Also, you can encourage members to voice their concerns. You can actually teach the value of dissent and whistleblowing. In the wake of the corporate scandals from earlier in this decade, in particular the Enron scandal, Time magazine, who were their people of the year? Do you remember? It was these three whistleblowers, these three people who'd whistleblown on these corporate scandals, and they said, these are the people of the year. And they were trying to switch. A lot of people have this kind of attitude where you shouldn't rat out your partner, right? You shouldn't rat out people you're with. You shouldn't tell on people. But Time magazine was trying to change those norms. They were trying, and in general, culturally, we were trying to change those norms and say, wait, whistleblowing, when you're working for a corrupt organization, is actually a virtue. It's actually a good thing to tell on bad behavior if it's hurting lots of people, as indeed Enron was. So you can encourage members to voice their concerns. You can try and create a culture that's friendly to dissent. And then finally, the simplest thing you can do is make committee voting anonymous, right? If you think back to the political cartoon, or the little cartoon that we showed earlier, what's the big problem there? They're all thinking in their heads, this is an awful decision, but voting with their hands, sure, this is a great decision. If you had just done anonymous voting, you'd be able to capture the fact that no one in the group really agrees with the decision. Okay, so that's groupthink, and let's take a 3 or 4 minute break, and then we'll talk about breaching. All right. Welcome back. All right. Let's talk about breaching. A couple organizational things. The Cool and Luke film, if you can't see it next Friday, or sorry, next Thursday at 5 p.m., it'll be at the Media Resource Center. We'll put it under reserve right after we show it. And then also, there'll be a B-Space announcement that will clarify where it is, because you don't know where it is. It's either going to be here or Wheeler, we think. You don't know. You do know next Thursday at 5. We're going to give the papers back, the conflict essay papers back after class today. We'll try to end class a little bit early so that there'll be time to get it back to all of you. And here is the breakdown of who has your paper so that you'll know who to go to outside on the little grassy area outside there. If your last name is A through D, you'll be going to Alma. Alma, do you mind standing up really quick just so they know who you are? Alma, she's wearing a gray shirt. She'll be out there, and she'll have your paper if you're A through D. If you're E through K, your last name, then you will go to Nora. Nora, do you mind? Yes. Wonderful. And that's pretty funny. If you're L through R, which sounds like, isn't that like half the alphabet? Okay, I got the shaft, and I got half the alphabet. You're coming to me. And I'll be very bad at this, so sorry in advance. So this is me. And then if you're S through Z, you will go to Kristen. Kristen, there you go. That's Kristen, S through Z. You have a question, ma'am? No. The movie is purely for the purposes of a paper assignment. And I'll give you some information about the paper assignment before you watch it. Cool. Okay, are there any questions about getting it back? Okay. Everybody's whispering, is whispering. Yes. Oh, all 4 of us will be out there, out in front, afterwards, after class. Is that cool? Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay, good. Okay. There's a lot of dissension. I hear humming. I hear. I couldn't agree more. Okay. So we talked about groupthink. We talked about groupthink. Now let's talk about breaching. Breaching, another one of these selected topics as we talk about conformity and norm. So what is breaching? The breaching is defined here as the purposeful breaking of social norms. Why would you do some kind of breaching? Why would you break social norms? Shouldn't you conform? Of course you should. But you might do it because you want to identify what is and is not a norm. If you go around and you start breaching, selectively breaching, doing a variety of strange things, you might find out norms that weren't apparent to you or weren't explicit, that you were taking for granted, that were implicit in everyday life, that you just didn't have proper perspective on. It can be hard to see something until you see its opposite or enact its opposite. So when you start breaking the rules, it can sometimes make it more clear to you what the rules are. Also, it can be useful for studying how norms and conformity are upheld in society. A lot of the time, we wind up obeying rules of conduct and norms for appropriate behavior, and we just do it because everybody's doing it, and we assume that they're enforced by people, that if you didn't do them, you'd be sanctioned or made fun of or silently judged, and maybe that's the case, but you don't know until you break them. That's why you should go out of this class and start breaking all the norms you can. But in all seriousness, it is a good way to study how norms and conformity are upheld or maybe not upheld. You know, maybe it is the case that if you broke those norms, nothing would particularly happen. So I keep telling you, breaching is the purposeful breaking of norms. What is a norm? Well, if you're in this class, you've probably heard this term a lot, but you may or may not have heard it defined. So here's Christine Horn, a friend of mine, who defined norms as rules about which there is some degree of consensus that are enforced through social sanctions. When you conform, you're essentially conforming to norms. And really, in reality, people just have to think that the norms are enforced. They don't have to actually be enforced. What matters is the subjective belief that a norm would be enforced. That can be sufficient to make people fall in line. So, for example, politeness norms are generally not enforced. You know all those rules about how you have to use one of the forks for salad and another one of the forks for like your entree. They're not even on the left, right? They're like on the right or something. Man, I am a nightmare with this stuff. Like, when I got this job, like, all of a sudden I had to start having dinner with people who ate properly, you know? Whatever that is, I don't even know. And I was going to restaurants with entrees that cost more than $7, you know? And I'm very uncomfortable in these situations. I don't know the rules. I'm, like, doing stupid stuff, like cleaning my hands with, like, the tap water, you know, or, like, you know, I don't know. I don't know what the rules are. I think, you know, I'm, like, cleaning my fingernails with, like, a spoon. You're supposed to use the fork, apparently, you know. So I don't know, and I'm always breaching, and they're like carrying, you know, and the waiters, they're classier than I am, right? The bus boys will be taking the forks away, and they'll be like, oh my God, he used the wrong fork, but we'll pretend he didn't, you know? And, because we're paid to do it, you know, make this idiot look good. And so I don't know these rules, and one thing I've found is that essentially when I eat dinner, it's one big breach, you know? Now when I eat dinner with my colleagues, it's just a litany of breaches. It's like the Ollie G show. Like I'm just a fool of a man, and I'll be like eating the chicken, you know, with my hands. I guess you don't do that, you know? I don't know. Probably, I thought you did. It makes more sense to. And that's why they give you a napkin. But anyway, so it's all just one big breach, and what I find is no one enforces the norms, right? We have all these norms, and I know I'm breaking all the rules, and nobody makes fun of me. Nobody sanctions me. Why not? I'm not exactly sure. But the point is that you have to just think that they'll be enforced. And now, having found out that they're not enforced, I'm eating the chicken with my legs, you know? Like, I don't know, you know? Like, yes, sir, you have a question. Good example. Yeah. Right. That's possible. That would explain what's happened with my social life over the last couple of years. Yeah. So yeah, maybe you don't get invited back. That's possible. I know that's possible. Yeah. No, I think that there are subtle ways in which politeness norms are enforced. But I think what's most interesting to me about it is that in the situation, you break a politeness norm, generally it is not enforced. And in fact, there's even rules of etiquette that say you shouldn't enforce politeness norms on people. How many of you are familiar with Emily Post? Anybody? Okay. So what is Emily Post? Can somebody help me? It's like Miss Manners. Yeah. Wait, what? It's a... Exactly. That's exactly it. She is the woman that wrote the Bible of Etiquette. She wrote the book about politeness norms. She was the one that went down and codified what we're all supposed to implicitly know. But how are you supposed to know this if your parents didn't know it, if nobody tells you and nobody talks about it, and it's supposed to be subtle, and they don't enforce it when you break the rules? Obviously, I'm very frustrated with these rules. But she wrote a book, and the book is ridiculous. Like, you should get a copy of this book, read this book, and find out all the rules that you supposedly were supposed to know the whole time that you've been breaking your whole life. There's also just absurdly specific upper class crap in that book, like how you're supposed to address like a former lieutenant's wife, you know, at a cocktail party, and you're supposed to call her like, you know, Miss your honorificness or something like that. It's just absurd. Or like how you're supposed to shake the hand of a defrocked priest or something. You know, it's like. Yeah, I don't know. They're like ridiculous rules for every category of person of consequence that you're supposed to follow. But what does Emily Post say you're supposed to do if somebody starts eating the chicken with their hands because they're a Philistine? What does Emily Post say you're supposed to do? Yes, ma'am. Exactly right. Exactly right. Perfect answer. You're not supposed to make your guests feel out of place, and that's the biggest rule of Emily Post. And actually, it's kind of a sweet rule, right? It kind of redeems all the like, here's how you talk to the lieutenant's wife stuff. She says you're not supposed to make your guests ever feel out of place, so you put your fork down, you pick up the chicken, and you start eating it with your fingers as well. And so in a way, I've now redeemed Emily Post as actually like this very sweet person who advises that you break all the norms in order to make your guests feel comfortable. And so that's an interesting thing, right? That these politeness norms are understood. They undergird the social order. They make eating dinner with middle-aged people a total nightmare. But they also, they're also weirdly not enforced. Breaching. So norms, as you would imagine, vary across cultures. In fact, one definition or one sense of what culture is just a bunch of different norms that are bounded amongst some group of people and have some history of evolution, cultural evolution. So norms vary across cultures and are what we would say in sociology, we'd say they're culturally bounded. That you can't know for sure what the norms are going to be in some other culture until you get there. You can't assume the norms here will apply there. This is almost like the most basic observation about culture, right? Like I'm telling you this and you're rolling your eyes in your head. You're like, yes, I know. I learned this in the first week of my cultural anthropology class and whatnot. But nonetheless, I will rehearse this just in case you forgot it. Things that are inoffensive here may be offensive elsewhere. So like the OK sign in Brazil or something, right? Isn't this one they always talk about in anthropology? This is bad. I should even stop doing it. Right, it's Brazil, right? Or okay, well, wherever it is, it's supposed to be like up yours or something very much a grosser version of that. The hand that you shake with, in certain countries you don't shake with the left or the right hand because it would mean, because you're supposed to be using it for various bathroom-related purposes. Also, things that are inoffensive elsewhere are offensive here. Gender roles, gender norms, the way that women are treated in a variety of countries is considered normal and routine there and would be considered offensive in our culture. And then often, I don't know if you know this, but in tourism, you know, if you've been a tourist in other countries, this often entails a series of accidental breaches. So in Japan, I went to Japan for 2 weeks a couple years ago, and again, my whole time there was just this tomfoolery, Keystone Cops, slapstick, just Rob's breaching all the norms for 2 weeks thing. I did everything wrong. There's a way that you're supposed to fold your robe, you know, like when I didn't go out in a robe, but you know, there's times when you would, so I went out in a robe, you're not supposed to do that. But yeah, there's a way you're supposed to fold your robe like one side over the other. Does anybody know this? Left over right, thank you. And if you fold it right over left, this is inappropriate for what reason? That's how they fold it when you're dead. So it means you're saying, I'm dead. And it probably means you're sort of being disrespectful to like dead relatives and whatnot. So this is very bad. Also, you have to be careful how you leave your chopsticks in like a bowl of noodles, for example, at the end of the meal. No, you don't. They tell you that you do, though. Don't cross them. Exactly. So don't stand them up in your rice bowl at the end of the meal because that means something about death as well. And so, yeah, so of course I just went right for all these taboo practices and was just like folding the robe the wrong way while putting chopsticks in the rice. And Japanese people were just like aghast, you know, shocked. Meanwhile, I saw some weird shit by my standards, right? Like, by my cultural standards, I was seeing strange things that I just couldn't even believe. I was walking off of a subway one. This is so stupid, right? This is like Rob telling you his tourist stories. I'm sure yours are better. I'll just tell you mine. I was walking off of a subway platform one time right next to this businessman in a three-piece suit, you know? I don't even see people in three-piece suits very much. So I was kind of like, oh, wow, that guy's like weirdly well dressed, you know? And then we get to the top of the subway platform, and he just starts urinating on the street. Just openly urinating on the street, and I'm like, oh my God, you know? I was totally shocked by this, and the people were like, yeah, you know, it's important that you not stare or look at them, you know, when they're doing that. It's sort of okay, sort of not okay, and you should be like Emily Post and not make light of it, you know. So I started urinating at the top of the street. Yeah. But yeah, so it was just I wanted to make him feel comfortable, you know, and that's how we do it in America. So. I'm going to get in so much trouble for that. Okay. So, okay, what happens in Soc 150A stays in Soc 150A. Okay, I mean that, please. The webcast ensures this. So anyway, so tourism can often entail accidental breaching because you don't know what the norms are in order to obey them. History of breaching. Breaching as a concept was maybe not invented by Howard Garfinkel, but first was scientifically studied by Howard Garfinkel. And Howard Garfinkel studied ethnomethodology, this kind of approach to the study of everyday life. And I think I mentioned earlier in the semester that ethnomethodology is the longest word that I know, and I'm not exactly sure what it means. But you can look that up and learn more than I know about ethnomethodology in about 5 minutes. But the point is, Howard Garfinkel was interested in how people make sense of and understand the world, and that's probably what he meant by that big long word. And he pioneered the use of breaching experiments in order to study how the social order is upheld. How is it that in everyday life we maintain this fluidity of interaction, and what happens when it's broken? So again, it's this logic of if you break the norms, you'll see how they're enforced, whether they're enforced, and what they mean. So We'll get back to Garfinkel, we'll get back to breaching, but let's talk about Stanley Milgram for a second. So Stanley Milgram's the guy who did the shock experiment, right, the obedience experiment with the electric shocks, and he's famous also. He ran just tons of really interesting, cool studies, in my opinion. I'm a Milgram apologist. A lot of people hate Milgram because he did these obedience experiments. Fair enough, but he also did a lot of creative stuff, like the most famous breaching experiment in history. So Milgram had his students ride the New York City subway trains and go up to riders who were sitting on their in their seats and ask them for their seats. So these are all like graduate students at CUNY Graduate Center in New York, where Milgram taught and was a professor. And he trained them, these like 22 to 28-year-old students, because that was kind of the age of your average grad student in those days. And trained them, go up to maybe even target older people, and go right up to them. Doesn't matter how many open seats there are, go up to them and say, "Do you mind if I have your seat?" And what the students reported was a variety of weird reactions. People had never had this happen to them. They thought it was super, super weird. They'd look at them weirdly. But another thing they found was that the people would comply most of the time. So people would be like, "I don't know why you think you own my seat, but there's nothing I can do to resist your request, so it's yours," So it was this very strange thing where, like 80-year-old women would get up and give these graduate students, I know, right? I know. Would get up and give these graduate students their seats. So that was interesting, right? That people comply with requests, and there's been a lot of research on that. They comply with even absurd requests. It's also interesting that the people, were so freaked out by it. So that they're sort of like freaked out by these breaches, you're breaking the norms, but also we're going to try and keep things going smoothly here, and I'll do that by acquiescing to your request. But the biggest observation about these breaching experiments was something that was going on inside the graduate students' heads. And Milgram himself went and participated in the experiment as a sort of research assistant and reported the same thing. They felt extraordinary stress. And you can read accounts that Milgram wrote of like trying to psych himself up to do this, where he'd be sitting on the subway train or standing on the subway train. At the end, he'd have his victim targeted, and he'd be trying to psych himself up. And as he went to go do it, he'd just have this like huge stress and anxiety like rising up in him as he went to go break this norm and fracture the social order. And so one of the big observations from this study is that norms are enforced in our heads, right? One of the reasons we don't go around breaching, one of the reasons we do follow these social norms is that we would feel great stress and anxiety were we not to. And in a way, we watch ourselves, like the Freudian superego, George Herbert Mead's generalized other, Foucault's panopticon. It's a common idea in social science. We enforce society on ourselves. It gets in our head, and we get stressed out. Another example of this is, like a couple weeks ago, I fell out of my chair at the office. I went to go sit down. I know, it's just a series of embarrassing stories about me. I went to go sit down, and I missed the chair, and I fell on my ass, and I got embarrassed. No one was watching. I got embarrassed, and I got flushed like red, even the physiological signature of being embarrassed, right? And nobody was there. Why was I embarrassed? Nobody was watching. But that's just it. When you break norms, when you embarrass yourself, people don't even have to be there because you enforce it in your head. You go to break a norm, your cortisol level goes up, you get stressed out, you fall off your seat, you get embarrassed, your face flushes, and so on. Breaching is now common in entertainment, right? Ever since Candid Camera in the 60s, they've had these shows where people are sent out and purposely break norms. Jackass has some of this. Have you guys watched the Jamie Kennedy Experiment? I think this is the best example of this. I mean, it gets a little bit monotonous over time, and Jamie Kennedy is maybe a little annoying, but he is brilliant. They have some breaches in there that are just unbelievably hilarious to me. So the Jamie Kennedy Experiment's great. Obviously, the Ollie G show is great. Boiling Point, I put this up here because somebody told me about it. I'd never watched this. Is this a good show? Yes. Okay. They're breaking norms, aren't they? Okay. And then a lot of shows from overseas. I actually think the European shows where they have people break norms are among the most hilarious. I don't know the names of any of them, or else I'd refer you to some. So Garfinkel had his students do breaches as a class assignment. You're probably seeing what's going to come here. So it's a common social psychology assignment to have people go out into the world and purposely break social norms and then document what happens. And it's extremely possible that you might be asked to do this at the end of the lecture. So Garfinkel was the first person to do this. I think it was the 1960s. He was an ethnomethodologist, and he was like, he got his students, when they went home for holiday break, to go break social norms. And so one of the ones he had was he would send them home for Christmas, holiday break, whatever, and behave like tenants when they went home to their parents' place, you know? Like leave a little tip in the morning when mom, you know, made the bed. When mom does, you know, does your laundry, you know, you say, you know, you don't say anything, you don't say thank you, you just pay her, you know. And then it studied what happens. How do your parents react to that? Not well. Or you'd have people, or this is what people have done in breaching things, is go to McDonald's and then order something that's not on the menu, which is sort of weird. No one ever does that because everybody knows exactly what McDonald's sells, right? Like if you didn't know what McDonald's sells, you'd be a fool. So you'd order a pizza or a Whopper at McDonald's. Other things people do, stand uncomfortably close to another person while having a normal conversation. This is one that's happened a lot. Tip your friends for being kind or nice to you. Try to negotiate bus fare, right? Be like, I don't think that I'm not going the whole way, so why would I give you the full $1.25? See what happens then, you know? Shake your head when you say yes, nod your head when you mean no. That'll freak people out. It's also very hard to do. Ride the elevator facing the wrong way. Elevator breaches. Have you seen somebody do that one? You've done that, yeah. That'll freak people out, definitely. Elevator breaches are very common. For some reason, when people get the breaching assignment, they head straight for an elevator. And when I was a freshman in college, I was in a breaching experiment where people were just sitting on chairs in the elevator. I didn't think that was much of a breach, but it did kind of weird me out. And they were like talking to each other about my reaction. They're like, yeah, he thought that was pretty weird. They're like, he seems uncomfortable. And I'm like, I'm right here, you know? Yeah. So. Actually, my friend Will Kalkoff, who designed a class, he had somebody turn in a breach. Let's see if I can find it here. He had somebody turn in a breach that was really elaborate. When some, you know, it was like a breaching assignment, and let's see here. Oh yeah, this one's kind of cool. This is a very weird breaching assignment. This is not copyrighted, so it can be webcast. Yes, okay, this one. This guy basically, he had to do his breaching assignment. We're talking like a 3-page paper assignment, and he just threw himself into it. This undergraduate that was a student of my friend Will's. And actually, I emailed Will recently and was like, hey, can you send me this breaching assignment? He was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. So the guy just dresses up like in a chicken outfit and wanders around campus. And it's set to hip-hop, and I don't know why that is. Maybe the breach is on us. So if you were to actually do this, like videotape your breaches, you would get some kind of extra credit. If you could do something this elaborate, I mean, you all can do this kind of stuff, right? This would be nice. I would like this. So. I mean, it's not required, but it would be awesome, you know? So it goes like, people don't like the chicken man. Yeah. Yeah. And that's all it is. It's just people staring at the chicken man, basically. But I like it. I don't know why. So that's good. That's encouraged. We would like more of that. And so, yeah, as you were guessing, you have an assignment, a breaching assignment that'll be due. No, it's not Friday. Ooh, how'd that happen? Thank you. But it is February 19? Okay, thank you. So just to get this straight, this will be actually graded, unlike the rest of these have been. Just a second. Okay, so it'll be actually graded A, B, C, D, F, you know, like a grading system. So please fulfill all the requirements. Also, you know, some of the papers you've been turning in, they're a little messy. So please, God, proofread this paper, you know. And review the parts of this lecture on breaching. And here's the way the assignment works. Make a list of 3 breaching exercises that you could do, and for each one, identify the norm or rule that would break, that the breach would break. Explain how you would respond if someone did this around you. It could be just a few sentences. This is hypothetical. How would you respond? And then, and this is the fun part, actually do one of them and detail the experience, both your perspective on how it went and the other person's perspective. So you understand this? 3 breaches. Explain what they are, identify the norm, explain how you would react if this happened, and then go do one and say what happened and the way that the people reacted and how you felt. And yes, you have a question. If you do a video, just turn this in normally, turn in the normal assignment, and then the video would be like extra credit. Yeah. Man, I got like 100 of those videos. That would be a fun Saturday for me. That would be awesome. Yeah. So yeah, seriously, if you want to do the video, that would be just awesome. Okay. So I encourage you to get creative. These ideas, they don't have to be brilliant. You can get, you're not gone yet. They don't have to be brilliant, but the more creative, the better. You're not going to be great on creativity. You just have to get it right, But it would be awesome if you did get creative with this. And I'll collect the coolest ones for lecture, and I'll talk about them. So, for example, last year when I taught this class, one of my favorite ones was this guy. He just went up and down Telegraph, slapping high fives to people, and detailing people's... It's very simple, but it's actually kind of hilarious, right? And he just detailed people's reactions, and the paper was great. It was all like proper social science write-up. He's like, he found that some people, would respond. He found 3 classes of response. Like, some people would enthusiastically be like, yeah, and then other people would be like, they'd do it, but kind of wonder why they were doing it, And then other people wouldn't even respond. They just kind of looked at him funny. And he was like, in the write-up, he's like, everybody enjoys a good high five. But it's not always appropriate to do it. Another person got up in front of a movie screen when a movie was getting ready to play and just stood there staring at everybody, just like staring at them, expressionless. And people went bananas on her. They were like throwing stuff at her, and she just stood her ground, like Gandhi or so, like she thought she was taking this big stand for the purposes of the breaching assignment. But I want to emphasize, please, God, don't do anything illegal or immoral. And people always violate this, and I want you to know that I mean it this time. Don't go order beer in a bar even though you're underage and be like, Professor Wheeler said I have to go. Please do not do that. Don't get me in trouble. I could easily get in trouble, so I'm trusting you. I maybe shouldn't, but I am because I trust you. So please, God, don't do anything illegal or immoral. And have a great week. I'll see you next Tuesday. We will hand back the assignments outside there. Remember who has yours. Okay.